It's time, of course, to discuss the second of the four cars in GT7's October 1.25 patch, and this one I feel like is probably the car which a lot of players drove first, I would imagine. The full-on race car of the four, the NISMO GT3 variation of the Nissan GT-R. 2018 shape, of course, newer, slightly different visually, unless you actually put them side by side to see all of the differences. A different spec, for sure, and we'll talk about that in a second, but also, as I alluded to in my overarching review of the update, a couple of things which don't actually seem that great about this car on the surface. For example, it has less power, the point level is no better, and it's more expensive. Doesn't exactly herald a great start, given the difference between the normal road-going Nismo and the existing GT-R. With those two differences, well, the Nismo is legitimately one of the fastest cars in the game in a straight line, let alone through corners. With this racing version, it doesn't necessarily look that way, at least initially. Price-wise, the normal one is 450 grand. I was personally expecting this one to be 450 as well, because let's say it as it is, there's really no reason for it not to be, but it isn't. It's a completely arbitrary 600,000. Not the only Group 3 car, of course, to be more, technically. The Ford GT, which I talked about recently, is $1 million, so that's even more. But this one still doesn't really bring anything to the table that deserves an extra 150 grand, at least on paper. Now, in terms of power, as I said, it does put out less. The existing model puts out around 600 horses, this one around 576, so not too much of a difference. In its favour, though, it is lighter, 1,285 kilos, so it's still no flyweight, but of course it has regulations to consider, and no matter what you do, the Nismo is always going to be a big car because the GT-R is a big car. It's exactly the same as a Bentley GT3 would be, which incidentally is the new GT3 car I would like to see in the game, not another Nissan GT-R, but that's by the by. Like the Bentley though, this car falls under a category of racing which a lot of people I don't think really give that much thought to, but it is something that you might want to bear in mind if you are more of a tactical driver. If you like to really plan ahead for a racing season, say for example in sport mode or any kind of competitive player-to-player event, you will want to consider some of the smaller minutiae of the differences between GT3s or Group 3s in general, and what I'm talking about is something which I have discussed before. Now this is something which back in the older Gran Turismo games which featured it, which were, 4, 5, 6 and I guess the PSP version, there was a car called the Jay Leno tank car. It was a completely unique, totally crazy vehicle that I'm sure many of you will remember, but one of the things which I've always thought was funny about that car is that despite having fantastic power, surprisingly decent performance in the game for something so ridiculously big and heavy, it didn't actually matter that much in practice because it was so physically large that even with 930 horsepower on tap, it just literally fills the road. So even if you're faster than your opponents, and believe me, I used it to win events, I actually used it in GT6 to beat Vipers and Corvettes at Willow Springs, so it can be done. But the fact is that a large car makes things like manoeuvring through tight corners, and especially overtaking on really tight technical circuits, Tokyo for example, that much more awkward. Now, this may not bother you in the slightest, but this is something which the GT-R definitely has working against it. One of the relatively few things working against it, in fact, in any form. The GT-R, by these kind of standards at least, is a very big car. That's a fact. No matter how light you make it, if you made this thing weigh 900 kilos, it would still be the same physical size. You can't get away from that. So even though, sure, it's powerful, it's fast, if you take this around the aforementioned Tokyo, or especially a circuit like Bathurst, where you've got really, really tight roads and corners, well, you're going to have trouble on occasion. Because something like a much smaller, say, Alfa Romeo 4C or anything like that, which is really small and nimble, even though those may not have the straight line oomph of a GT-R, they will often be quicker and lighter on their feet through these really technical corners. Now on a wide open track, the Nismo will serve you very well, and despite what I just said, don't imagine that this is some kind of a planet-sized vehicle that can't be worked with. Clearly not. There are loads of people that love GT-Rs. I'm just saying that it's those small things which are easy to overlook and gloss over, which might actually give you a bit more of an advantage on a certain type of track. So if you're in, for example, a certain type of, as I said, online race, or even in career mode on a certain track or a certain series which involves maybe a lot of tight circuits, you will want to consider the physical size of your car. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it is one of the relatively few things that I can say negatively about the Nismo, because it's a very strong car. Now, speaking to that, this is also a very strong car. It's cool for GTR fans, of which there are many, that we do have this newer iteration in the game, but as I said earlier on, I really do wish that this slot had been changed to a far more significant and interesting newer vehicle, because this vehicle was only included really because of Kaz's personal driving exploits. Yet again, it's an example that's happened many times over, but again, to highlight the point that I said about us not bothering with duplicate cars when the game has more unique cars to make up for it, well, likewise back in Gran Turismo 4, when the Ford GT was the cover car and ridiculously OP, way better than it should be, purely because it was Kaz's favourite car, we didn't really mind, because there were still loads of other great cars. Whereas now, we've already got a GTR, we've already got a couple of variations of it if you include the Super GT spec machines as well, so this really doesn't feel like the most necessary thing around. For some people you might love it, but for me I would certainly have chosen something like the aforementioned Bentley Continental GT3. Imagine adding the Bentley Continental just in general. You could have the road car, you could then have a Group 4 version, Veyron style, and you could have the GT3 as the Group 3 machine. The Bentley is actually a perfect new addition to the game, and I would have much rather had something like that, even if that were the 3 cars in the update. But that's not what they did. Maybe they will in future, we'll have to wait and see. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on this car. Certainly not a bad machine. You may even personally find it to have some advantages over the normal one, so put that down below if you find this a better GTR to work with than the older one, by all means. But aside from that, of course, stick around on the channel for the coverage of the other 2 cars still to come, and of course yesterday I already covered the Maserati Mirac if you haven't checked out that review. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.